Selamat siang, saya Allan Nairn. This is an article entitled, "Do I Have the Guts?" Prabowo asked. Am I ready to be called a fascist dictator? On July 9th, the world's fourth most populous country, Indonesia, will hold an election that could result in General Prabowo Subianto becoming president. General Prabowo, the brother of a billionaire, was the son-in-law of the dictator Suharto, and as a U.S. trainee and protege, was implicated in torture, kidnap, and mass murder. In June and July 2001, I had two long meetings with Prabowo. We met at his corporate office in Megakuningan, Jakarta. I offered Prabowo anonymity. I was looking into recent murders apparently involving the Indonesian army and was hoping that if he could speak off the record, General Prabowo might divulge details. I came away disappointed. Prabowo shed little light on those killings, but we ended up speaking for nearly 4 hours. My impression then was that his comments were extraneous. Prabowo talked about fascism, democracy, army massacre policy, and his long, close relationship with the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence. But at that time, he was out of power and in political isolation. Other generals were the threat. But now Prabowo was on the verge of assuming state power. And looking back at my notes, I realize that some of what he said has now become relevant. I have contacted General Prabowo asking permission to discuss his comments publicly, but not having heard back from him, have decided to go ahead anyway. I think the harm of breaking my anonymity promise to the general is outweighed by what would be the greater harm of Indonesians going to the polls having been denied access to facts they might find pertinent. Prabowo and I had a revealing discussion about the Santa Cruz massacre. This was an Indonesian armed forces slaughter of at least 271 civilians. It was done on November 12, 1991 in Dili, occupied East Timor, outside a cemetery where a crowd of men, women, and children had gathered. I happened to have been present at that massacre and managed to survive it. Prabowo told me that the army order to do those killings had been, quote, imbecilic. He said he thought the order came from General Benny Murdani, but said he wasn't certain. Prabowo's complaint was not with the fact that the army had murdered civilians, but rather that they had done so in front of me and other witnesses who were then able to report the massacre and mobilize the outside world. Quote, "Santa Cruz killed us politically," Prabowo exclaimed. "It was the defeat," unquote. Continuing the quote, "You don't massacre civilians in front of the world press," General Prabowo said. "Maybe commanders do it in villages where no one will ever know, but not in the provincial capital," end quote. The remark was telling as an acknowledgement that the army routinely massacres, and in establishing that Prabowo finds this acceptable, if the killings are done in places where, quote, "no one will ever know," unquote. In September 1983, there was just such a series of massacres around the little scene village of Croras on the mountain of Bibileo, East Timor. The official UN-chartered Commission for Reception, Truth, and Reconciliation in East Timor, the CAVR, later reported regarding the Croras slaughter, quote, "The Commission received evidence that Prabowo was stationed in the eastern sector of Timor-Leste at this time. Several sources have told the Commission that he was involved in the operation to bring this civilian population down from Mount Bibileo, shortly after which several hundred were killed by ABRI, the Indonesian Armed Forces. The Commission also received evidence of Kopassus being involved in these killings." And it says, see Chapter 7.2, Unlawful Killings and Enforced Disappearances, end quote. As Suharto pulled Prabowo up through the ranks, his commands were implicated in other mass murders, including one in West Papua, where Prabowo's men masqueraded as the International Red Cross, and the now well-known covert operation in Jakarta, where they disappeared pro-democracy activists. The fact that Prabowo and I had agreed to sit down was in itself a bit unusual. I had called for Prabowo to be tried and jailed, along with his U.S. sponsors, and I had helped lead a successful grassroots campaign to sever U.S. aid to the Indonesian Armed Forces. I had been banned from Indonesia as, quote, "a threat to national security," unquote, and General Prabowo's men had tortured friends of mine. But, for my part, I had made the cold calculation that if it helped solve the recent murders, sitting down with Prabowo would be worth it. For Prabowo's part, I do not know, but I did get the impression that he enjoyed the chance to talk shop and compare notes with an adversary. At that time, 2 years after Suharto's fall, Indonesia had a civilian president. He was the blind cleric Abdurrahman Wahid, popularly known as Gus Dur. The Indonesian armed forces had undermined Gus Dur's presidential authority. They had done so in part by facilitating ethnic religious terror attacks in the Malukus. 3 weeks after my second meeting with Prabowo, Gus Dur was impeached and ousted. Today, Gus Dur is often remembered fondly. The current Prabowo campaign uses footage of him. But that day, to me, Prabowo ranted about Gus Dur and democracy. Quote, this is Prabowo speaking, quote, "Indonesia is not ready for democracy," Prabowo said. "We still have cannibals. There are violent mobs," unquote. "Indonesia needs," Prabowo said, quote, "a benign authoritarian regime," unquote. He said the many ethnicities and religions precluded democracy. Prabowo said regarding Gus Dur, quote, "The military even obeys a blind president. Imagine, look at him, he's embarrassing," unquote. And continuing the quote from Prabowo, "Look at Tony Blair, Bush, Putin, young, ganteng, handsome, and we have a blind man," end quote. Prabowo called for a different model. He mentioned Pakistan's General Pervez Musharraf. Musharraf had arrested his country's civilian prime minister and imposed dictatorship. Prabowo said he admired him greatly. Prabowo ruminated on whether he could measure up, whether he could be an Indonesian Musharraf. Quote, "Do I have the guts?" Prabowo asked. "Am I ready to be called a fascist dictator?" Musharraf had the guts, Prabowo said. As to himself, he left that question unanswered.